In the game of nuclear brinksmanship, in the words of oft-cited 1983 film Wargames, sometimes the best move is not to play. But in the real world, when one side chooses to play, and various factions of third parties insist on one move or another, deciding on one's next move is extremely difficult, and the path chosen may have irreversible consequences. The Cold War was rife with these types of situations, and no less during the 1980s, when the Soviet nuclear arsenal had reached an all-time high, and its deployment of mobile SS-20 intermediate-range ballistic missile launchers were posing strategic complications to the détente reached during the 1970s. Germany sat firmly in the crosshairs, and as the United States was pressured to counter the Soviet deployment while simultaneously receiving protests from peace activists for doing just that, the Cold War began to heat up.
Well, I'm not a crook. I've burned everything I've got.
Military-industrial complex.
A new world order.
But we are here to destroy the control over the industry of other people.
I did not trade arms for hostages.
It's been time to deal.
Na pełny rozgląd wymysłów захватчиков.
Myth20c podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Myth of the 20th Century. I'm Hank Oslo, and I'm joined here by my co-hosts Adam Smith.
Hey, everyone.
Hans Lander.
Hi.
And Nick Mason.
Hey.
And today we're going to be discussing the Euromissile crisis, the final battle of the Cold War. Throughout the late 60s and 70s, the USSR was engaged in military buildup of both conventional and nuclear forces, which culminated in the introduction of the SS-20 missile system. This intermediate-range ballistic missile system was designed to strategically isolate Western Europe from its NATO ally, the United States, and arguably to establish Soviet domination, or at least neutralization, of the entirety of Europe. This culminated in a political crisis where you had hundreds of thousands of German civilians, arguably extremely cucked and arguably influenced heavily by the Soviet Union, taking to the streets to demand essentially their subjugation, but was ultimately countered by a robust introduction of opposing forces by the United States and eventually strategic parity in the form of no missiles whatsoever. So this covers sort of a fairly wide stretch of time where events are kind of happening intermittently. So it's a little bit of a slight misnomer to call it a crisis per se. But perhaps it's best to start with why does anyone at the time sort of care about some particular missile system being introduced by the USSR?
Well, it didn't seem like it was noticed by the public. It was more a response that the NATO forces were taking that the Western public started protesting. Is that roughly correct?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, this was sort of a argument about what to do that happened in elite circles. And actually only after sort of an initial decision was made about how to respond, was there any sort of kind of mass public involvement. But I mean, it's fair to ask, like, why? Because the freakout was an extremely German-centric freakout. Why were they so worried about this?
Yeah, and I don't quite understand what the big difference is between the new mobile missile platform and, I guess, the silos plus the submarines plus all the bombers that the Soviet Union had aimed at the rest of the world. What is so uniquely threatening about a tube on wheels? That's basically what the SS-20 was.
Right. It's the kind of cinematic erector, so to speak, in launcher. I think it was in that terrible like Cold War comedy thing where like Chevy Chase has to stop the missile from flying away. I think
it's a distinctly Soviet design. I mean, they show those in the Mayday parades, I believe, but they also had railroad systems. So I guess what this, to just my intuition speaking here, I don't really know, but it just seems like this would be a difficult to track device because it's on wheels, and that means you can move it through the forest off of ready-made roads instead of kind of rail lines, which are a little bit more easy to observe, I suppose.
Yeah, it's not just that. So the idea is the standard kind of way that World War III at this time is projected to break out is there's some sort of crisis, and for some reason the USSR decides to send all of their tanks, which they have at this time a shit ton. They have like a 3 or 4 to 1 ratio of forces available, invading Germany, rolling over Germany, rolling through Belgium, rolling through France, etc. To stop this, the USA nukes with tactical nukes, short-range nukes, basically armed by individual military units.
Well, they had Pershing 2s, and they had, which were intermediate ballistic.
That happens later. So
that happens later.
2s, the Pershing 2s are sort of the response, but they have basically bombs that would drop beneath an aircraft and like kind of short-range rockets.
You're talking about the Soviets now?
No, I'm talking about the U.S. So like
nuclear
the way that
missiles, effectively.
What Air Force was carrying those? Germans, I thought, had the nuclear, at least.
Not
British
not
too.
Not until later.
Really?
So they're Brits, they're U.S. and they're French, and they all have nukes, but they're all fairly short range at this time, for the purposes of like playing out this scenario. So basically, you're the supreme NATO general, who's always an American in Europe. You see a tank column streaming into Germany. You realize they have way too many tanks to beat. You nuke the shit out of them. Just that tank column. You're not like flying your ICBMs across continents to like knock the crap out of Moscow. You're just nuking this particular tank column. And the idea is that this kind of goes back and forth because the Soviets don't want to nuke like the mainland US. They don't actually want like their cities to be devastated. So they keep it sort of confined to the scenario where everybody is kind of mutually nuking the crap out of Europe in the context of conventional forces going to and fro. And ideally, if you're the U.S., eventually you send some ships over with your sort of reserve components and you hopefully win the war. So this kind of results in the stable equilibrium where the Soviets know that the U.S. can stop them from taking Western Europe. The U.S. knows that it can also stop them with their conventional forces, and they don't really have an interest in conquering Eastern Europe. So everything's basically stable. The problem comes in when the USSR has the ability to threaten Western Europe and only Western Europe specifically. So if you launch an ICBM from somewhere in Siberia, nobody really knows where it's going. And it's plausible to assume that it's headed straight for the USA for your missile bases or for New York City or for whatever. So
you can't tell what trajectory it's on?
Not on launch. You can after you've seen it in the air for a while, but by this time your response time is pretty low.
Right.
Especially, So if you see something coming from like some giant Soviet missile base, you see the flares of the rocket engine from your satellites, you're like, holy shit, the Soviets are launching everything. We have to launch everything, and now everything is fucked, basically.
And so if it's a cloudy day, are they using infrared? I mean, how do they detect that?
Yeah, it's infrared. It's a whole spectrum of satellites and radiation signatures and sensors and what have you.
Yeah.
Now, if you have some random missile on a truck that launches from somewhere, and you know that all of their truck-based missiles are these intermediate range missiles that can hit Western Europe, but they can't hit the US. If you're the USA, you know, okay, the Soviets are trying to take some military base in Belgium, or they're trying to take Bonn or Paris or whatever, but they're not threatening New York City. I have no way of retaliating against this other than deciding that I'm going to actually start the full-on nuclear exchange where Moscow's nuked, New York's nuked, Chicago's nuked, everything is nuked. So essentially what this lets them do is the Soviet Union is able to strategically hold Western Europe hostage. They can say to somebody like the Germans or the Belgians, how confident are you really that if I do something against you, that the USA is going to risk World War III in coming to your aid?
What I don't understand is how is this any different than before? Because they still could have attacked the West. It just wouldn't have maybe these nukes per se. They could still use their ICBMs though, if they wanted to do that. But
it's this.
It's signaling clearly that this is not directed to the U.S. So it's just Europe. So U.S., do you really want to do this kind of thing?
Exactly.
And it gives them a bit more of an edge.
ICBMs, you're almost certainly going to be launching them against US, so the US retaliates.
Mm-hmm.
If you launch your intermediate range missiles, then the US is able to metaphysically know that they're not being targeted, and so the temptation is to stay out of the fight altogether.
Okay,
so this is why there's kind of a building freak out at this time about the introduction of these weapons.
So it seems like this tactic, this scare tactic the Soviets used on the Europeans, worked probably from 1957, I suppose, when the U.S. started placing nuclear weapons in Europe, until about 1980, when the Soviets became aggressive towards Afghanistan. At that point, the Europeans could no longer allow themselves to be told that the USSR didn't really pose a threat.
I mean, they totally allowed themselves to believe, so certain factions of the European left, especially, were always super cucked. That were like, oh, NATO is an encircling alliance, and the Soviets only want peace, and if only we would disarm, then democracy would flower in the USSR, and we would all be happy-go-lucky Europeans together.
Jordan Peterson.
But now NATO's putting tanks on the former USSR's border, and these same people or their kids are cheering about it.
I think they do that a lot.
Europeans,
I don't know how unique that is.
Not like the same Germans that we're talking about for the purposes of this, because this is a pretty German-focused dynamic, because they're the only major Western European power that doesn't have nukes.
So, is what you're talking about, does it have anything to do with the pop hit by Nenya, 99 Red Balloons?
I'm dead serious. Yeah, it does. So when did that song come out? 80s?
Geez, it was in the 80s for sure. I'm not sure. I can pull it up.
So 1983, which is peak this thing. So let's kind of back up and let's talk about it, because by the time we get to 83, this whole thing has fully blown up. The political dynamic is fully realized. If we're still talking 1976, 77, basically nobody except for hardcore policy wonks is paying attention to this yet. So,
and they didn't even bring it forward to the press, I would imagine, until they started. I mean, probably somebody leaked it, but I don't know if they were going to secretly put these Pershing missiles into Europe, but that was the response.
That's super later. So let's talk about what happened kind of concretely at this time. So the introduction of these missiles, the German government, which was fairly recently elected, Helmut Schmidt came into office in 1974, a couple of years before this started to kick off. So he is freaking out, essentially, that he has a lot of domestic opposition by the left, and he has this sort of what looks like an attempt by the USSR to sort of strategically isolate him. So he's demanding of the U.S. government, or elements of his government are demanding of the U.S. government, that you need to do something about this immediately. Like, you can't let them threaten us without some ability to threaten them symmetrically. You need to send over missiles right the fuck now, before basically the domestic German left figures this out and the Soviets figure out that this is working, and we end up having to do something where we are effectively no longer cooperating.
Were those missiles even in existence? I mean, did the rocket ranges that he wanted exist, and did they have to change the warheads? I mean, that's sort of my question. Like, tactical nukes apparently were already there, so what's the difference with those and the new ones?
So if you are the USA and you have the same sort of intermediate range missiles that the USSR was deploying, you can basically pull a Cuban Missile Crisis in reverse. So it's an extremely nice idea if you're the USA to be able to threaten the Soviet Union that, hey, like, flight time from a missile stationed in West Germany to Moscow is like 10 minutes, which is way too quick for you to react. So if you happen to have those forces in place, then you have an excellent bargaining position to threaten them, to elicit concessions from them, whatever.
That makes sense, but was the technology available until later, is my question.
Not really. So, like, they had sort of older, shittier versions that for various technical reasons weren't super useful. Like, they had the Pershing 1. The request was that they, like, develop as quickly as possible something that was sort of symmetric.
So they wanted to be able to hit Moscow, not the oncoming tank division, because they had a artillery-fired nuke. There's a very famous photo of that actually being tested outside of Las Vegas. But I don't know if that was ever really deployed anywhere. But they had that at minimum.
Yeah, they had the ability to, like, launch tactical nukes against, like, tactical formations. What the Germans wanted was for the U.S. and for NATO more broadly to be able to threaten the USSR
from Europe.
From Europe, without involving necessarily the continental U.S.,
right,
which mirrors the ability of the USSR to be able to threaten Western Europe without respect to the continent.
And it was too much of a demand to place on the U.S. Navy's ballistic nuclear missile fleet to have them close to the USSR.
So it wouldn't have worked. So you can also detect a launch from a submarine. So if you see a launch coming from some submarine, at this time, the submarine launched missile platforms. It's basically the same situation as the ICBM's situation, where you have to assume that they're headed directly for your heartland, and you can attribute that directly to the U.S. There's also issues with the launch positions. Like the Russians had, like, a fairly robust anti-submarine program.
It sounds like the U.S. didn't want to get pulled in necessarily, and so if they gave it to the Europeans, it's coming from the Europeans, not the Americans. Whereas if they had the nuclear submarines launching, then the U.S. was going to get nuked because no other force. Well, I think the British, though, they had a smaller fleet.
The Brits and French had similar things. There's also sort of a task.
So let them take the demand. Why do we have to always put in our missiles?
Well, because the Germans are too much of pussies to nuke up. So, like, I mean, if you're
I'll let France and Britain do it.
Well, you could call them
not
pussies, or you
like-
could call them an occupied country that have been
Germany
systematically
definitely doesn't
brainwashed into
like
being
Germany
cuckolds.
definitely doesn't trust France to step in on their behalf.
Yeah, they trust America more. That's interesting.
Well, so this is the interesting thing. So when you put nuclear weapons on German or Turkish territory, it's sort of wink, wink, nudge, nudge implicit that, like, okay, if things get really hairy, so you got like a couple of security guards around this thing, but those security guards are kind of encouraged to fuck off, and suddenly they're German nukes. So the idea is also that, like, in a crisis situation, like, the German government basically grabs these things and now they have an independent nuclear capability, which is what they wanted all the time, but they also don't want to be a quote-unquote nuclear power because super cucked.
Because Hitler.
Exactly.
Well, the U.S. also had, like, dozens of army units inside of West Germany.
Yeah, that's definitely
ever
true.
since the end of World War II. So they were invested in making sure, what was it, like?
Yeah, but those guys are somewhat expendable versus an American city, which is slightly less.
Right. Well, at one point, the U.S. was giving the Pershing 1As to the Germans and training them up on using them.
Yeah, that's the whole nuclear sharing idea. That, like,
but those only had a distance at maximum of like 460 miles. So that was what you were going to use to hit Soviet tank columns as they were coming through Poland.
Right.
Is that tactical distance? Is that what it defines tactical? It's probably the warhead yield as well, but that sounds about right.
Small warhead yield. I mean, tactical distance, and you.
So how far is the horizon? Is it like 50 miles or something? I mean, that's like over the horizon.
Depends on how high you are.
Yeah, of course. But I mean, assuming Europe is pretty flat. I mean, aside from Switzerland, but assuming they can't see further than, let's say, 100 miles out, that's going to be curving over to something they can't see.
They're all sort of like over the horizon, at least. I would definitely assume that.
Yeah.
Right.
But the horizon is not really your sort of limiting factor. It's like, you got a nuke, you can miss by a few yards.
Okay.
I mean, I'm looking at just a map of U.S. army units in West Germany at 1987, and we had army units almost as far north as Hamburg. We had ones down in Nuremberg, at Stuttgart, at Würzburg. I mean, we had army units across the country, and some of them, only maybe 20, 30 miles from the East German or Czechoslovak borders.
Right. So the U.S. had like a sort of strategic commitment. The smart thing to do would to be have your divisions back by like a couple hundred miles.
Right.
Let the Russians tucker themselves out and then have sort of an elastic defense. But they had a political commitment to the integrity of German territory, because the German army was like one of the predominant armies in NATO in Europe. Like, if you measure by boots on the ground, I'm pretty sure it was the largest.
Right.
So you can't just kind of like let them be abandoned to the sausage grinder and say, no, totally, we're going to have you on the flip side. A lot of this is trying to assuage the German government so that they actually do have incentives to remain your ally.
And later in the war, later in the Cold War, I mean, towards later 70s, early 80s, it's talked about in this book, The Last Battle of the Cold War. The NATO or American NATO strategy was to pepper Soviet tank columns and just Soviet movements with the Pershing 2s, have the Germans use the Pershing 1As if the Pershing 2s weren't as effective, just to lay out as much damage as possible, and then at super close range hit them with the BGM cruise missiles, which were nuclear tipped, and you could put those on the back of a truck and just launch them out, and then they would divert Soviet troops into essentially corridors that they controlled along the West German border, and would then try and concentrate in certain areas to eliminate, I get mostly Soviet, but also just the rest of the Warsaw Pact.
Yeah, so this is like a plan that the Germans could have gotten behind, but the technical capability at this point doesn't exist to do that.
Right.
Because they just don't have those Pershing 2s that they would later deploy.
And there's no ability. Nowhere is there a strategy like we're going to push into the Warsaw Pact. Every strategy was
they don't have
we're going
the
to hit,
ability to do that.
Yeah, we're going to hit the Red Army, the Soviet military, as much as we can inside Poland, inside Czechoslovakia, inside East Germany, as much as we can. We're just going to pepper them with tactical nuclear weapons and just create a bulwark and hold them at whatever cost at the West German border.
Right. So the German demand sort of comes to the leadership of NATO and specifically Jimmy Carter at this time. And Jimmy Carter has his pluses and his minuses as a president. I think we can all agree, and just as a kind of a guy in general. Mm-hmm. And at this time, he basically encourages NATO to make the worst possible decision. This is the double track decision, where basically they agree that they're going to try to negotiate to get rid of these SS-20s from the USSR. They're going to try to negotiate for 4 years. And if at the end of these 4 years negotiations fail, then they'll try to deploy this sort of reciprocal capability.
Why 4 years?
One might fucking ask that, because that seems to be like the weakest possible bargaining position you could possibly generate. And there's documents from the Wilson Foundation, from a lot of the internal discussions of a lot of the European governments, where they're like, well, holy shit, what are we supposed to do for 4 years, guys?
I mean, it is an election cycle. I don't know if that factored in.
What's our negotiating leverage exactly if we have nothing in Europe effectively that can counter this thing? Like, what are we supposed to trade off?
Well, that was sort of my suspicion. Was it sort of a technical problem where they had to delay for 4 years? I mean, what would you propose instead? If they don't have those missiles, the Pershing 2s, what are you going to do?
Yeah, I mean, the U.S., once it made the decision, the U.S. was able to deploy these things in pretty short order. It looks, from what I've read, like they had the ability to modernize a lot of these weapons on pretty short order. I mean, they could have simply had a policy of, they come off the assembly line and we ship them to Germany. But
they could have put fakes too. I don't know if they ever did that, but they could just roll out some, vehicle with a tube on it. I mean, there's been many countries have done that
with a cardboard missile.
You can make it out of steel. It's not hard.
That probably wouldn't fool anyone, because you have to appropriate money for these things. They're pretty expensive. And I guess you could just spend it on like hookers and blow. It is the 80s.
Honestly, I might want them to think that all we had was fakes, and then we might have some real ones too. You never know. Maybe
Hank, is all of this technically part of the SALT negotiations?
I don't think so.
The SALT negotiations were sort of an earlier thing. That was mostly a Nixon initiative.
Right.
And there were those were all sort of with respect to ICBMs and not having sort of an unlimited arms race in intercontinental missiles.
Mm-hmm.
So these were all sort of uncontrolled weapons where nobody had made any particular commitments.
Well, I suppose SALT was kind of going on concurrently with some of this, because SALT technically came to a close in 1979. Maybe that was my confusion.
I believe that was the negotiations, but the U.S. Never ratified SALT II, but then Reagan agreed that he was going to follow it by executive decree. It was sort of a
so there's a weird kink to it. So basically everything was ready to go, and then the Soviets poured into Afghanistan, and I guess there was a Soviet combat group discovered in Cuba, and it freaked everyone in Washington out. So the U.S. never ratified or the U.S. Senate never ratified it, but I guess Reagan honored it until '86. And then,
do we know that those reports, quote unquote, of the Soviets being in Cuba are real? I mean, you could make
could be fake.
A case that was the military kind of just trying to drum up some support.
Like, from what I recall, it was kind of the Russian equivalent of the Army Corps of Engineers. That was going and building some sort of facilities in Cuba. At least this is how I remember it. But it's like, what are you going to do? Like, everybody in Florida has a gun. You can't invade Florida.
And it would be no different. I'm sure that there were plenty of U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in Turkey alongside the Soviet border in the Caucasus. So,
I mean, if the Soviets really wanted to screw up the U.S., all they'd have to do is blow up Houston. I mean, screw Florida. It's not very strategic to the U.S. But if you knock out the oil system, they're in deep trouble.
Well, it's the refining facilities that are really key in Houston. If you nuked also anywhere along like the Gulf of Mexico, and you irradiate it, I mean, it would be a total devastation to the food supply of the South, effectively, because of the mass amount of fishing done down there.
Yeah, I mean that would immediately result in like any sort of land incursion into the U.S. Like everything would be on fire immediately.
Yeah.
So this decision, this dual track decision, or double track decision, happens in December of '79. Jimmy Carter loses the election, and Ronald Reagan wins, sort of on a campaign platform of not dicking around with the Soviets quite to the same degree. Basically, detente is over. We're fighting an evil empire, etc.
Well, that was kind of what Helmut Schmidt was getting at with Carter. I mean, effectively, Helmut Schmidt was a lot more hardcore on the Soviet issue, despite, I think, having run on and campaigned through most of his life as a politician as an anti-nuclear forces candidate involved. And I think at one point he even organized some kind of some kind of NGO that was determined to ban the deployment of nuclear weapons in West Germany. And all of a sudden he did this big heel turn when he got into power in '74 and was pushing Carter to develop new missiles, to give Germans more control over missile supplies.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny, he was a socialist. He had kind of a reputation as, about as German nationalist as a socialist can get, I guess, at this time period. The Israelis really hated this guy for sort of unrelated reasons. He made some unguarded comments about, Germany respects the right of all people to self-determine, including the Palestinians. And he was immediately like, "Oy vey, you're firing up the gas chambers! Like, you can't wait to do it all over again, can you? You dirty Nazi rat!"
Wasn't he a member of the Hitler Youth as a child?
Yes, he was. So
everybody.
You want to talk about Helmut Schmidt? This is a good
opportunity. Something might have rubbed off.
Yeah,
So
I mean, well, go
Helmut
ahead.
Schmidt was he was you're right, he was a socialist. I don't know, I guess you could say a social democrat. He wasn't very hardcore left wing, but he, in his later years effectively became a neoliberal. Like he was definitely one of the pillars of European Union neoliberalism. And in his youth, he was a member of the Hitler Youth. He tried to downplay his ties and said that he left. But then when he was older, they found records from like 42 and 43 indicating that he was a committed ideologue of National Socialism, and he worked hand in hand with the NSDAP and so on. So he had a pretty deep
Very
involvement.
bad Goyim.
Right. Very deep involvement with this group. And so it actually makes sense that he would then become an anti-American nuclear forces social democratic economist type, just based on realistically what a lot of the NSDAP stood for. And it was really weird that in his later years, when he actually took a lot of power in Germany, became a leading figure, he was the man behind getting the G8 together, or one of the main men. He was the man behind the OSCE. He worked hand in hand with the French prime minister at the time, his name escapes me, to bring the European Union closer together. He was behind monetary union, behind a European central bank. As soon as he got into power, he was a pro-EU sovereign, as opposed to a German, full German nationalist or sort of German populist, which is how he got into power.
Well, so what you're implying is that there is some continuity there in which he is looking to see a resurgence of European power.
Yeah, and clearly under Franco-German control. Like there was no disputing that was his endeavor. A Franco-German led European Union opposed to, it seems like, Israel, opposed to the Soviet Union, and somewhat opposed to the United States.
It's just astonishing looking at the map right now of West Germany. It's right on the border of the Warsaw Pact, and Austria is as well, but that was kind of a non-important country strategically. And so it's basically Germany against the entire Warsaw and Soviet bloc. And got to remember, like, Germany had been carved up now like 2 or 3 times, and so it was much smaller than it is today, let alone before the conclusion of the First World War. And it's just this sliver of land, and right next to France, which is got to be at least 3 times as big. It's astonishing they had to carry that load.
And the East German military industrial base was probably maybe not the largest, but certainly the most advanced inside of the Warsaw Pact. I mean, the East Germans rivaled the Soviets, in some sense exceeded them in terms of their industrial output and their
they were the most productive per capita of all communist countries, and that's more evidence to show that biology matters, probably, if not just culture at least. But they had I think pretty advanced, and then to this day I think they still have a competitive optics manufacturing sector, which I can't remember the name of the company, but there's still a company in East Germany that makes very good lenses and things like that.
Right. And so at the outbreak of World War III, it would effectively be a German civil war. I mean, right away there would be tanks from both sides rolling across the border.
I suppose you could view it as a civil war, but it's more like communist versus non-communist. I suppose
true. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, in fact, within 20 minutes of missiles flying, it would be American and German armor columns moving against Soviet and East German armor columns.
Right.
So Reagan is elected. Helmut Schmidt makes sort of the same pitch to him. And Reagan decides that he is going to continue this double track decision. I think if one reads between the lines, Reagan was actually not kind of a super foreign policy minutiae guy. He wasn't really a minutiae guy for anything.
He's
a
more
big
of a
picture
for Bonzo kind of guy.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm guessing that his advisors were sort of like advising him not to sort of try to escalate things too quickly without good reason. Certainly not before you had sort of the credible ability to do so and make it stick. You don't want to be coming out there with a bunch of promises that you're not able to fulfill immediately.
He also had other things to worry about right off. I mean, right off the bat, he was worrying about the Iran crisis. Effectively, like, is the United States going to be in a state of war with Iran soon?
Right. The economy was not doing that well at the time either. It was sort of a tenuous time in general, so it's not super surprising that he sticks to that same line and sort of defers the decision. He does begin sort of this process of negotiation with the USSR, but coincident with that, this is where it starts to get into internal German politics. The German press and the German left, which are pretty isomorphic at this time, go absolutely apeshit. They are talking about how this cowboy is going to start World War III, and Germany is going to be a sacrificial lamb to this great power conflict and tool of capitalism, and etc. And you start to see in July of '81 these mass protests happen. You had 400,000 people on the streets of Germany in October '81, promoting nuclear disarmament, peace, quote unquote. Imagine giant faggoty air quotes around like all of these expressions. You had campaigns like European nuclear disarmament or end, various other groups that campaign for nuclear disarmament, the Greenham Commons Women's Peace Camp, who all sort of end up focusing their efforts on promoting to the maximum extent disarmament of the Western powers. And this is happening in the context where the Soviet Union has significant infiltration of a lot of the West German governments, especially the UK and Germany. Helmut Schmidt's predecessor actually had to resign because there was a spy scandal with his one of his main aides or secretaries. And there's a severe suspicion that a lot of these campaigns were sort of done with implicit or explicit coordination with Moscow, particularly because these guys who are running these campaigns were allowed to go into the Eastern Bloc and do these sort of astroturf demonstrations and petitions and whatnot, where they would be wandering around to sort of random Eastern European dissidents, trying to get them to sign on for the idea that the NATO powers were being overly aggressive in Western Europe, and that they needed to disarm and let peace have a chance.
Right. So Yuri Bezmenov, for those who have seen his kind of legendary interview with G. Edward Griffin, this is what the Soviets called active measures. The Russian for it would be aktivnaya meropryatия. And this, in the context of Yuri, it was counterespionage. So it was things like seducing and intoxicating foreign diplomats who came to the Soviet Union and getting them to confess things ever so slowly. But this sort of agitprop stuff became really common in the 80s. And there was actually a paper, I think, from the Reagan Library, the Reagan Institute, or some conservative think tank, but they acknowledged that Reagan was aware of this activity pretty quickly, that the Soviets were the ones who were behind the peace measures, and so they knew that giving in to the peace measures was just giving in to the Soviets, even if there were a lot of people in Europe behind it.
Well, even if they weren't behind it, I mean, what can you realistically do when the Soviets are not going to disarm and you're the one who's disarming? That's sort of a lose-win situation, and you're on the bad end of that deal. You really need to negotiate from strength, arguably. I would. They wouldn't, I guess.
You're not as woke as some of these German academics, where you had Willy Brandt, this predecessor of Helmut Schmidt, was hardcore on the left, and he funded a large amount of what became to be known as "quote unquote" peace studies or peace research.
Wasn't he the mayor of Berlin during the Berlin airlift too? I mean, it's sort of ironic.
Yeah, he won a Nobel Prize for basically cucking to the Eastern Bloc and trying to reach kind of a rapprochement. Lots of families visiting East and West Germany for the first time in 30 years, which is a good thing. But he also was responsible in large part for funding a lot of kind of new left takeovers of German institutions, kind of as we're seeing in the U.S., where you had kind of coteries of radical academics kind of coming up with the window dressing that the radical leftists in the Bundestag, their parliament, needed to have in order to justify their cucking. So you had guys like this guy, Dieter Senhaas, who is almost a caricature of our present academic strain in the U.S. I guess it takes a little bit longer to get here, where he's basically taking giant bong hits and talking about, what is violent, man? What's really violent? Society. Illiteracy is violent, man. Inadequate healthcare, man. If you die because you've got a disease, that's violence, man.
Silence is violence, I've heard.
Exactly. Right. So, in order to fight this violence of inadequate healthcare or illiteracy or Western advertising, if you need to have a violent socialist revolution in order to stop that violence, I mean, sometimes you got to break a few eggs to make a German omelet. You had this other very prominent guy also involved with a lot of peace campaigns, Johann Gultung, who asks rhetorically, clutching his pearls, is personal violence necessary to overcome this structural violence? We define violence as the cause of the difference between the potential and the actual, between what could be and what is.
So you effectively have these communist continental philosophers in German universities trying to rationalize Soviets nuking all of Western Europe.
Yes. I mean, ideally, they wouldn't even have to nuke you because you would just sort of bend over and invite them in.
Yeah.
And then you would have full socialism, and since you would no longer have this threat of NATO encirclement to the Eastern Bloc, everything would be peaceful and nice and a glorious socialist future.
I mean, glorious socialism just involves allowing some Yakut in the Red Army to gang rape your wife while you watch, right?
I mean, I don't understand. Didn't Germany and Russia fight pretty bloodily during the Second World War? I don't get this Russia is going to save us attitude.
Yeah, it was more sort of philosophical. It was, I think they were entranced with and a lot of these
like
guys
these are the
were
intellectuals
honestly,
trying to like virtue signal essentially. But what
right.
about the
A lot of
people?
these guys are not
Was the
on
pulse of the nation?
on the like the Russian payroll. They're using the threat of Russia in combination with their suggestion that like maybe we just go limp, maybe we try that,
Right.
in order to try to boost their own status in this kind of like very feminine leftist way.
Yeah, that's exactly how I hear it and would imagine this is what's going on, because they're in these sort of very meek academic circles where masculinity is not exactly a virtue, and there's kind of a pecking order of, you know, who has the most citations and whatnot, but it's not based on sort of being aggressive. It's like, you know, who do you know? It's very feminine in many ways, and so the sort of like signaling that's going on is to other academics, and it's certainly not. I mean, military people, by just the training and the structure of military organizations, don't even make public statements. So all you're left with are these sort of very feminized people in universities who have the time to comment about this stuff. Meanwhile, the rest of the people are working or actually serving, and you've got these buffoons who are claiming to represent everybody, but what are their accomplishments? I mean, they've been reading books and writing books their whole life, and so how do they truly understand, you know, the sort of ground level affairs of what's going on when you're dealing with warfare?
The West German government eventually started actually putting a lot of their military leaders and sort of contradicting public experts on the ground to try to stem the tide of this. But by this point, like the Western German university system and kind of their intellectual class more broadly was completely captured.
Right.
You had kind of their 1968 generation, which is basically the same upstanding individuals as our 1968 generation, taking over a lot of these positions of power and trying to turn their intellectual domination, or at least their domination of these kind of institutions of labeled intellectualism, into a broader influence on society. And one of the ways that you do that is by these actions of, for instance, getting a shitload of people. Like 400,000 people is a lot of people, and it's definitely a lot of people in Germany. And this was just one particular protest. This was happening for years.
You know, and this was before the internet, and so this was essentially through beer hall, I guess, conversations, because you
had like little newspapers,
flyers, posters, things like that. But
exactly.
Well, I mean,
but that's an impressive amount of like concrete physical accomplishment.
Now, was this this may seem trivial, but was this on a weekend, or was there like a work walkout?
I have no idea.
Okay.
I mean, post World War II, the entirety of the German academic sphere was being handpicked by U.S. military officials who were, you know, working in concordance with the Anglo-American establishment at Harvard, like on who was going to be an acceptable teacher. Like, I remember at one point in post-war, Martin Heidegger was banned from being a professor for some length of years because he was an important pro-National Socialist philosopher. Like, he was able to guest lecture, but his academic career effectively died in the post-war because he was banned for several years, and then at that point the culture had, you know, a new culture had been created that was not conducive to him.
So I want to just mention that Václav Havel, the famous Eastern European, famous Czech, he's Czech. He's very, very forthright about being specifically Czech. Dissident. He has a hilarious essay in Anatomy of Reticence from 1985, where he talks about sort of like very woke Western European leftists on visa coming to Prague or whatever, and walking around and asking for signatures to promote peace and disarmament of NATO. And he describes pretty well like the sensation of what the fuck that a random Czech citizen or dissident would have been feeling. That they're trying to figure out, okay, so are you run by our secret police? Are you this much of an idiot? Do you just happen to align perfectly with the foreign policy goals of my terrible government because you're an idiot? Like, what's going on here? Sure, I'll sign your paper. Like, fuck off. It's a really good essay, but it sort of conjures up the surreal feeling of, like, imagine sending our like woke cat lady to I don't know, like fucking Syria to promote like peace in Syria.
Hey man, we had April Gillespie.
Yeah, fun times. But they did make kind of conscious efforts to rope in a lot of the USSR dissidents, and they actually like specifically focused on them. This was a thing, which is particularly interesting if you have an underlying hypothesis that large parts of that organization were run by various Eastern Bloc intelligence services. It's as if they're kind of using Western cucks to keep an eye on their own problem citizens, which is a nice kind of twofer. So the protests sort of continue without a whole lot of actual effect on the government, because Germany is sort of one of those governments that elections only happen when elections are called. Helmut Schmidt is kind of broadly popular. Things kind of stay on their course, and tensions in the Cold War kind of escalate and culminate with the U.S. Having this kind of gigantic military exercise with the rest of NATO, Able Archer, where they're basically simulating a war with the USSR, complete with moving your troops around, doing a lot of exercises. Everybody's kind of armed to the teeth and at maximal readiness, which freaks out the Soviets a lot, because military exercises are canonically one of the good ways to kind of camouflage actually getting ready for an actual immediate war. Kind of a this is not a drill type scenario.
Right.
Which sort of leads to a breakdown in negotiations between the U.S. and the USSR. So the U.S. decides in November '83 they have now the technical ability to deploy these sorts of weapon systems. So they begin deploying these Pershing II missiles that we had been talking about previously to Western Europe, along with some fun, fancy cruise missiles. And this essentially, solves the problem, I guess, from the perspective of the West German government. A lot of the kind of peace movement continues going, but with a kind of fait accompli under their belt. The forces that are interested in maintaining kind of a strategic parity in Europe, like, once you put them in there, taking them out is basically just an invitation, so you can't really do that absent some sort of tremendous pressure. So things sort of continue along these lines until the later Cold War, when tensions kind of subside and there's able to be a mutual agreement to withdraw forces on all sides.
I had a question about the placement of the Pershing missile launchers. Do you have the list of the countries off the top of your head of where those were?
Definitely Germany. I assume Italy and Belgium as well. I know that there were cruise missiles deployed in the UK. But
there were also cruise missiles in Italy.
Yeah.
Okay, now is that different than the Pershing?
Italy. Yeah.
Yeah, the cruise missiles kind of have, they're more difficult to detect. They have a...
now are those aircraft dropped? What's the deployment vehicle?
They're ground launched.
Ground launched. There's an air launched version.
So what's the difference between that and Pershing? Is it guided or versus like just a rocket?
It is guided. So the ballistic missiles are very quick to get onto target.
Mm-hmm.
The cruise missiles are very slow, but they're more difficult to detect.
Interesting.
So that's the kind of major distinction.
And they're smaller, so they can't carry as much of a...
No, they can carry a full-on... Like, nukes aren't that big.
Okay.
Like, the ICBMs are big because they have a lot of fuel in them,
right,
not because the warhead is so huge.
Okay.
And what was the potential fail-safe / Doctor Strangelove tier scenario of death by nuclear hellfire?
Oh, well, you would have, you had a number to choose from, a lot of which actually almost happened. For the longest time, the super secure lockout code was set to 0000.
You're kidding.
Which allowed anyone...
Oh shit, that's my fucking password, bro.
Yeah.
That's the combination to my luggage.
Change your passwords, dog. Yeah, so theoretically this allowed any asshole with physical access to arm the nuke, which doesn't mean that you can necessarily launch the nuke. Like, that's
insanely loose security. I cannot believe that.
Yeah.
But
well, because the military guys were like, well, shit. Like, what if you guys back in the home country get your ass handed to us, and we're left out here holding our dicks? Like, we would like to please be able to
remember,
have one last gasp before we're overrun. And not be like waiting for the phone call for you to like give us the code back. But it's still hilarious. It's like really, dude, 0000. Like, cool fail-safe.
I'll let that sink in for a moment. But going back to my question real quick, Hans, I was asking where they're placed. As sort of a lead into my main question was, how do the countries, so to speak, get the quote unquote right to host these launch sites? Because obviously they're going to cause protests if they have these fat targets and launch vehicles sitting in their home countries and the people don't like it, mainly because it's, I guess, aggressive of a stance towards the Soviet Union, and it's sort of involving them into be a target as well for the Soviets to attack, and sort of like the whole like not in my name philosophy, I suppose. So it seems like that would be a difficult one to convince your public of, and the leaders probably would prefer it if they were perhaps located somewhere else in Europe. Why would they want their own country to be a target as well? Was it that they wanted the ability to launch? It's not like you're protecting your own country. It's just you're sort of participating in the sort of mutually assured destruction concept. But individually, it seems like you'd want somebody else to take that task over for you, because then you could sort of free ride off of the nuclear umbrella from somebody else actually being the target.
Right.
Revenge is the best served with nuclear winter.
But that's not something that to me is very rational.
Yeah,
it's like if you're dead, who cares?
Germany has skin in the game. So Germany definitely wants in. They're the ones who've been howling loudest. Belgium and the Netherlands are like maybe the only ones where this dynamic comes into play, because like the UK and France have these weapons already.
You're painting a target on your back if you host these things. So it's like, how do you incentivize these guys to host them? Is really my question.
But it really only matters for like Belgium, Netherlands, Denmark, and Italy.
Yeah.
And like these are not countries that really tremendously matter. Like Italy has the fucking Alps, so nobody's going to be dealing with them. They're just going to roll over eventually anyway, because Italian army. Sorry to Italian listeners, but not covered in glory.
Not in 2 millennia at least.
So I mean, like the kind of Belgian and Netherlandish decisions are, I guess, a little bit interesting, but I know nothing about their sort of decisions. I will say that in general, Western European countries are, or Western European governments kind of have these weird little areas where they're kind of into public opinion because you're forming these coalition governments and the sort of main coalition partners are going to be in charge of the kind of key things like defense. So, I mean, you have to have a pretty huge sort of market in your politics for sort of like peace or defense policy as its number one issue before it really shows up hard in your parliament and in your government.
To Adam's point earlier, he was asking about the difference between the Pershings and the cruise missiles. So those cruise missiles only flew at about subsonic speed. This would have been the BGM-109G ground-launched cruise missiles. They were also carried around on a movable launcher. You could essentially tie to the back or put to the back of a truck that had 4 missile launch tubes. But the Pershing II flew at just over Mach 8. And that was essentially put from a specialized, or not specialized, but sort of makeshift launch pad that you had to actually spend more time setting up. And that would have had active radar guidance as opposed to some kind of, I think, what was the guidance system for the cruise missiles, Hank?
They had a pretty fancy, you can still make a fair amount of money if you are able to do the sort of algorithmic guidance where they're calculating their position based on a combination of maps of the terrain topology. They have downward-looking radar that's kind of mapping the topology that they're flying over. Mm-hmm. They have inertia systems where they can actually detect their own thrust. So they can sort of combine all of these signals and say, I'm flying over something that looks kind of like Poland, and I think I've been flying for about 45 minutes at this many G's of this acceleration over this many vector paths. And so I think I know basically where I am.
Were these Tomahawks or something else?
They were very similar to Tomahawks.
Okay, the Tomahawk system is probably, well, what Hank is describing sounds a lot like the Tomahawk system, which had an onboard map that had to be pre-programmed for its route, and then it would use the, I guess, onboard radar, essentially the onboard sensor system, to match up its current location to the map, and then if it was off by whatever it observed, it would try to correct back to the course that it was programmed to follow. And so it's probably similar to that.
And these cruise missiles flew, their operational range was 1,600 miles, whereas the Pershing IIs had about 1,100 miles for their operational range.
So that'll get you into Poland, but not Russia.
That would get you probably into Soviet, like the early part of Soviet territory.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the cruise missiles would not, maybe not the Pershing IIs, depending where you are. But if you're close to the East German border in West Germany, you could hit Soviet territory from with these.
Yeah, but Moscow's the prize, and so
Right.
That's
I mean,
the
the
big
goal
one.
again would be to be smacking Soviet tank divisions while ideally they're still inside the Soviet Union, so you minimize casualties and the rest of the Warsaw Pact.
Does anybody know, did the Soviets have a lot of tank divisions in Poland?
Oh, yeah. Shit tons.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And were they under...
Especially in the 80s when the Polish started acting up a lot. They stationed more and more Soviet troops instead of Poland.
They were crewed by Russians, not Polish?
Right.
I would imagine it would be crewed by the Red Army. Yeah.
Yeah. There is like an independent army for all of the countries in the Eastern Bloc. They often had units that were sort of rotating into the kind of quasi-frontline areas, or areas that would be expected to be the front line. But yeah, the kind of mainstay forces in Eastern Germany were the Eastern Germans and the USSR. So I don't know if we want to sort of get into the nitty-gritty details of the negotiation, because there's kind of a pretty obvious set point. Reagan had actually proposed in 1981 this idea of the zero option, that basically no intermediate range weapons for anyone, including on Soviet territory. The U.S. wouldn't deploy; they would remove any of these missiles or cruise missiles that they had. The USSR would decommission all of theirs. Everybody would be. And for various reasons around the kind of early war scares, this didn't happen. But after that tension died down, like, Reagan was kind of a weird guy in that he had these sort of moments of emotional resonance where he would see a movie like The Day After, which is this kind of weepy nuclear war melodrama, I guess is the best way to describe it, where you have a kind of gratuitous description of the horrors of nuclear conflict. And this would actually make an impact on him, and he would start thinking, man, like, nuclear weapons, these are no laughing matter.
Right.
And of course, every president wants kind of a big peace deal of one kind or another. So in 1986, there's this big Reykjavik summit where there's an attempt to kind of restart general Cold War disarmament negotiations, including jump-starting the what later became the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Agreement. There's one point where he's just kind of walking around talking with Gorbachev, where he seems to agree to kind of just everybody gets rid of all of their nuclear weapons, which would be a disaster, and his aides have to kind of talk him off of that particular precipice.
Let's discuss this for a second. I mean, on paper, obviously the enforcement is the trick, but I would be fine if we could sort of wave a wand, and this is obviously the rub, but if we could wave a wand and get rid of nuclear weapons, I'd be happier, unless you think that the world is safer with nuclear weapons.
I think it's actually much safer. And besides that, I mean, there's also the dynamic of... So
would you advocate for nukes for everyone?
No, I think that kind of a multipolar nuclear world as we have right now is actually pretty stable. In terms of, obviously we don't live in a stable world, but one of the things that's kept the peace...
I mean, when have we ever lived in a stable world is kind of the main question.
Right,
here.
Exactly. And, I can count on one hand, I think one finger, the number of kind of active casualties that have occurred between nuclear-armed powers. Like, I'm sure there's some randos in Vietnam where there happened to be some Russian advisors who are in the wrong place at the wrong time. But India and Pakistan kind of lobbing artillery at each other is really the only example I can think of. And that's in a large measure, these conflicts are prevented from escalating by the fact that neither side has the capacity to exert unpunished damage on the other.
That's assuming that both sides are rational, but our friend Nick on the podcast just cited a personality trait that you could argue is maybe a little bit different, in that if revenge is the only goal, who cares if you get nuked back? So,
well, I mean, so there's this tendency to kind of hyper dramatize the notion of what the use of nuclear weapons looks like as an all or nothing thing, but no country really operates that way. In the European context, there were a number of kind of options or scenarios, but very few of them incredibly involved everybody just like blast the shit out of everyone all at once. That's like the Dr. Strangelove caricature, but that's not how it actually seems to play out. It seems to play out where everyone has every incentive, ideally, to de-escalate at every point in the thing, because they can see where it's going. And you can see where it's going as you are structuring your forces, as you're deploying things. That's one of the reasons why the current Russians, are so freaked out by the deployment of U.S. missile defense in Europe, because they see it quite rightly as an attempt by the U.S. To be able to threaten them without consequences.
Well, could you talk about that for a second, Hank? Because they call it missile defense, but is that really what it is?
I mean, that's what it tries to be. So, long story short, just to wrap up the story of the INF Treaty, then we can kind of get more general. Basically, by this point in the Cold War, by 1987, things are clearly winding down in the Soviet Union. Gorbachev has other shit to worry about. And the U.S. is also amenable, so they sign the damn treaty. Everybody gets rid of all their stuff in Europe, which is the sort of culmination of European disarmament since the Second World War, really. But now, because of the current situation in Europe, this treaty is essentially a dead letter because of the deployment of things like U.S. missile defense. And yeah, like you can look at the sorts of stuff that the U.S. is deploying, say that these kinds of missile defense systems are not really like offensive systems per se, but they allow you, if they work properly, and if you gather enough data to make them work properly, they allow you to threaten another basically pure power without them being able to launch their weapons at you. Which, if you think about this idea of reciprocal punishment as a stabilizing force, and you remove one element of that, there's obvious incentive to escalate by the other party. You see exactly that. You see the Russians deploying multiple warheads on their missiles now, this MIRV capability, so that they can evade some of the U.S. prospective missile defenses. The problem is that this is also really destabilizing, because now everybody has more warheads than they have silos. So it becomes really easy to say that I'm going to try to knock out all of your nukes in their silos. So the U.S.
How come nobody in Russia protests about putting up missile defense or missile offense in Russia, like the West, where we protest the defense?
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. kind of has more money than it knows what to do with, so it's unclear how well this actually works, but it works really, really well at keeping the engineers at Lockheed Martin employed. So the Russians,
yeah, they built the THAAD system. That's the recent missile defense technology being deployed in Korea and I guess Poland as well.
Yeah, which, there's all sorts of different technical specifications with if your missile defense is sort of like attacking the missiles as they're boosting or as they're descending in mid-flight potentially. It's a lot of technical kind of arms wonkery that I'm not sure kind of alters the underlying dynamic of U.S. trying to leverage its economic resources to deploy a technical system.
But what I was getting at was, is it always protesting the U.S., or are there ever any protests against the USSR or Russia?
No, I mean, there weren't any at the time, and I don't think there are any now. Like, I think that if you're a Russian citizen, I mean, Putin
obviously during
like
the Soviet Union you couldn't do that, but
Putin has a pretty high approval rating in Russia.
Yeah. Right.
All reports.
Right.
And they kind of unveiled a new nuclear delivery system, the RS-28 Sarmat ICBM. And
which I think the NATO code name for that is Satan.
Satan 2. Because it carries 10 heavyweight.
What's the first one?
With enough power to effectively wipe out France with a single delivery. And so they're designed to get past the THAAD system and other anti-missile technologies that we have in Eastern and Central Europe.
Yeah, and that's
I remember this being debated in the Bush years, where they're like, missile defense doesn't work, it's impossible, and then occasionally, Lockheed will release or quote unquote leak a photo of a missile being hit off the coast of San Diego. I'm just curious how effective they are.
Yeah, I mean, the real answer is nobody knows for sure, and you really wouldn't want to find out.
Well, our Patriot system, which was deployed during the Gulf War, was not 100%. So I doubt that it's ever going to get that high, especially if you got MIRVs. And those are against the shitty Scud system, so I don't think an ICBM with multiple independently, what does the R stand for, re-entry vehicle. Yeah.
So this all kind of reminds me of SDI, which I kind of wanted to touch on before we wrapped up.
Star Wars.
Yeah, Star Wars. This was...
That's what the press called it. It was technically
SDI. This is old Reagan's pet project. So, in 1972, the U.S. and Soviet Union signed the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. It limited the amount of anti-ballistic missile systems that you could have at any given time to 100 or something like that. Basically, this was a way of ensuring that MAD stayed in place, that someone didn't get the edge in big theoretically, with 100% accuracy, knock out the other party, every single nuclear weapon launched by the other party, and then still be able to nuke them without retaliation. So Reagan and some of his buddies in 83, and then they kind of unveiled it in 84, cooked up the Strategic Defense Initiative.
Do you know by name any of the individuals who were supporting him in that? I just remember everybody being against him, but it was, I'm curious.
Edward Teller was the
big one. Teller was part of that. I'm trying to, there was another guy. I think it was Daniel Graham.
It was not popular. I mean, that was the general consensus, or the sense that I got from reading about it, at least.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it was total bullshit. So by 87, people had come out, leading physicists in the United States had come out and said this is at least 10, 15 years away from even being viable.
What was it? They were going to use lasers to hit missiles.
Right. So the gist of it was, I need a way to get around the anti-ballistic missile treaty and still be able to nullify the Soviet arsenal. So this is what scared the Soviets, because the Soviets had been drawn into Afghanistan. And by the way, when your enemy is making a mistake, obviously don't stop them, but also use every opportunity at your disposal to exploit that. So what the United States did was, with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, they turned to the Europeans and they said, "You see what happens? You see, they're not interested in peace. They're an empire, and they're coming for you next." So that helped nullify a lot of this talk of denuclearization from the European heads of state. Also allowed the United States to then train up the Mujahideen. And it also then gave Reagan an impetus to tell the American people, we're facing an evil empire that's only interested in conquest. It's going to take over the globe. They're in Afghanistan, and Iran's next, and everyone in Asia's next. So we need a way to nullify their nuclear arsenal. So it was going to be lasers, particle beam weapons, and then space-based missile systems, which the legality of the anti-ballistic missile treaty was allowed. If you had your anti-ballistic missile systems based in space, you could have as many as you wanted. So he approached Gorbachev. I mean, this is already known at this point when they had that meeting in, I think, '86, him and Gorbachev. And this is part of what freaked out the Soviets until, I think, '88, the Soviets had already kind of figured out that this is bullshit, but it was too late. They had sort of bought or they believed that Reagan was crazy enough to nullify MAD and nuke the entire Soviet Union and blow up their ICBMs in space with his X-ray weapons.
It wasn't just that system. It was sort of a broad-based buildup. I mean, I remember there were people told me about this, at least. They were scraping rust off of old battleships and putting them back in the ocean, and all this sort of glitz and glamour of reviving the U.S. military, much like Trump has been talking about. But what that did was it put a lot of pressure on the Soviet Union's economy because it was very feeble. It was probably, in terms of raw sort of world desirable goods, it was probably 10% of the size of the U.S.'s. Essentially, it was the oil that they were depending upon for their cash and their foreign currency cash. And it was in '85, I believe, that it was like James Baker, one of the Americans, went over to the Saudi Arabians and said, "You guys need to up your production."
Yeah, that was James Baker.
Yeah, to crater the price of oil, and that was a double whammy to the Soviets, who were already entrenched in Afghanistan, who were looking at this huge arms buildup in the U.S., and then they had their revenue go down. So their ability to keep up was severely curtailed by all this. And one could argue that it was Reagan's military buildup, in addition to these economic factors, as well as the Soviets' own involvement in Afghanistan, that ended the Cold War. So even if the SDI program may not have been actually effective in a real war scenario, it was somewhat effective propaganda. And if you actually look at some Soviets talking about that time, they do cite that as being a real challenge for them because they just didn't have the technology. I mean, the Americans probably didn't either, but the Soviets were so behind in computers they couldn't really match something like that. And so I think that was to credit Reagan. I mean, it was sort of, if you're fighting a Cold War to win rather than just fight a stalemate, it was a impressive accomplishment. It obviously was a risk, but it paid off, it seems.
I mean, some of this stuff existed inside of labs, like I don't know, like Cheyenne Mountain Complex, I think was one of them, and other places. Like, this technology existed on a very miniature scale, but it was nowhere near being deployed. I'm sure they told Reagan off the bat, "Look, dude."
Oh, but nobody knew when the Cold War was going to be over.
Right. So I've also seen it posited before that the whole thing was really just sort of like a blanket cover for militarization of space. And that as soon as the Soviets fell, the United States took advantage of this and sort of had black budget projects effectively under the SDI blanket, and then later blankets that were kind of related to SDI funding through Congress, which continued until like the 2000s. That this is all just some kind of aggregate grouping for various black budget projects for space development of some kind.
Yeah, that's completely plausible.
Yeah,
like the U.S. seems to have had a interest since really the 40s in escalation as their kind of default political or military position.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you expand into more avenues of conflict, the U.S., by virtue of its larger industrial base and economy, is going to win that fight if you make it any sort of a war by attrition, either by actual attrition, or by spending on these weapons platforms. And the question is, in the 21st century, when the U.S. is not the largest economy in the world, and where it no longer enjoys any sort of a technological edge over any of the competitors it might be competing against, does it still have this kind of default position of bellicosity? So far, the answer looks like yes.
Yeah. I mean, I remember at the end of, I think, the Gulf or Desert Storm, Colin Powell made it clear that the U.S. was going to start moving into both space and cyber as its new possible attack vectors for dealing with
cyber.
Yeah, cyber. So you can imagine in the early 90s, space and cyber, I'm sure sounded a lot more complex than what it's really turned out to be. And what it is now, I mean, space, I would guess that we probably have some kind of space-based object delivery system. Like, I don't know if it's the Space Rod program or if it's just missiles. I'm sure that that's been thought of or tested by this point. Now on the cyber front, it's just a bunch of nerds at the NSA writing like malware. It's not that immaculate. It's just, I'm going to shut down your power station. And
I don't think it's that simplistic. I mean, I think it's also the CIA involved. The CIA and the Israelis were responsible for getting the Stuxnet virus into Iran.
Yeah, right.
And CIA has its own division. I mean, NSA and CIA hate each other, so there's a whole bunch of that going on in many, many, many circles if they have the funding.
What do you say? I mean, people talk idealistically about the prospect of nuclear disarmament, and from our perspective, I mean, the people with their fingers on the nuclear trigger, so to speak, I guess it's more like a button? What does that look like?
It's a series of phone calls.
It's a series of phone calls
with red phones.
Yeah, with red phones. They're, the ones with their fingers on the dial, so to speak, are the exact people we don't want there. And as their power wanes and as their empire slips away, well, sure, it would be rational to be less bellicose, knowing these pigs, or rather these rats, they will, as they're backed into a corner, as everything that they've worked for, all their sick designs are sort of chipped away by the rising of the rest of the world and to some kind of parity of nuclear power. Would they not be more inclined to pull the trigger as they squeal on their death knell?
It's hard to say.
Yeah. It's really weird because I basically agree with everything that you're saying, but the rhetoric is just so spookily reminiscent of the sort of narrative coming out in 1980 about how ideally we would get rid of these weapons and we can only work on our own side, so let's do that, and we can't let these insane people the last throes of capitalism keep their fingers on the button. God only knows what they'll do on their way out. I mean, there's obvious huge differences in the actual circumstances, so I don't think that rhetorical similarity is
Well, and a prerequisite to any kind of like political movement for disarmament in the United States would be a recognition that the United States empire is in fact a danger to the world and to danger to us. And as we see present politics going, the U.S. empire is great because it promotes homosexualism and democracy abroad. Also, that's another.
That's all that's left.
Could you imagine?
I mean, what else? What else do you have? Trans fats, Pizza Hut, and soda pop. I mean, what else do we make?
It just gets like it's funny because the dystopias that we saw. I mean, nuclear, the cultural effects of nuclear politics. I mean, this predates a lot of what you're talking about, Hank. But at least in the United States, I mentioned. I was being serious too when I mentioned Nenya, but like you see it in the United States, and it permeates all kinds of dystopic science fiction, even in music, all the pseudo counterculture stuff.
The trick, Nick, is how do you get there? I mean, if you've got a nuclear armed empire, who gets the nukes, and how do you get rid of them if nobody gets the nukes?
Well, sure, but what I'm saying is like none of these dystopias and none of the like nightmare scenarios really anticipated sort of the image of a clown climbing out of a car filled with a bunch of other clowns, like waddling over to a nuclear briefcase and like nuking some like country because they don't permit children to be sodomized.
This grotesque caricature known as Hillary Clinton basically had war with Russia as one of her campaign.
How credible is that accusation? I kept hearing that, and I'm like, really? Would she really do that? I mean,
honk.
Yeah, she would. You know what's even more perverse caricature of all the dystopias we saw was the potential takeover of a Western nuclear power by an Islamic party, which is a very real possibility.
Great point.
France in the
well,
next
we already had this in miniature. So the U.S. still has nuclear weapons at that one particular airbase in Turkey.
Yeah,
and there was a solid couple weeks where it was really unclear what the status of those forces was, and if they would be told to leave, if they would be told to leave the troops, or troops leave, nukes stay. It's sort of fraught having.
Well, you have a problem in your empire when it's uncertain, like what the vagaries of the political winds do in Turkey determine your nukes are going to be.
And suddenly Turkey has fucking nukes. It's
right.
But Hans is
honking noises, Nick.
But Hans is describing like even the next tier up, like goofball nightmare clown scenario where like you have some kind of form,
You guys ever
the former.
Camp of the Saints, where towards the end of Camp of the Saints, which we should do a show on at some point because it's kind of really reminiscent. Paris has been turned into like the Paris multiracial commune. I believe it's literally what it's called.
Wait. Are you talking about now or some hypothetical?
No, he's talking about Jean Raspal's prophetic.
So there's a group of French resistance who are effectively like sniping. Refugees or whatever still coming on shore, and the French multiracial commune literally just bombs them, and they all die. The ultimate clown future would be, Macron being replaced by a member of the Muslim Brotherhood in 20 years, and that member of the Muslim Brotherhood using the French nuclear arsenal to deliver a nuke to Budapest or I suppose
Israel
or somewhere in Poland. Not Israel.
No, they wouldn't.
Somewhere in Poland or
Budapest. They would never.
I mean that is the ultimate clown world that is a potentiality at this point.
Yeah, I mean it's again these people like in imagining like I don't know, four-armed deformities crawling around the nuclear wasteland with like I don't know, a bunch of Kalashnikovs everywhere, and after the great Russo-American War, like no, instead we're even considering it's a possibility that like Western Europe becomes a nuclear Islamic power. It's like
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that.
Well, that's like the
is-
Kalergi theory. I mean, it's sort of it's dumbfounding, from a kind of national interest point of view.
Yeah, but the Kalergi would require the Kalergi is better applied when you just have a generic mocha mass of nothingness. I mean, that doesn't have its own ideology and where's she at eschatology?
No, the ideology is consumerism.
Let me propose a scenario. Let's say in 20 years, this is an actual reality in France. What do outside powers do? Let's say the United States. Let's say Trump has actually, and his successors have actually made an impact in the United States. Have sort of prevented it from becoming, the neoliberal empire sphere. And it's sort of looking at the situation, going, why do we have a radical Islamic caliphate in France with ICBMs armed and ready to go? Like, what does the United States do? What do the Russians do? Assuming
We're gonna have a big, beautiful mushroom cloud. Most will die, but some will survive.
Right.
I'm sure.
I mean, this is really what nuclear politics is going to become: is who gets forcibly disarmed first because their government has been either totally paused or totally Islamified.
Yeah, ideally they do the smart South Africa play on their way out.
They get rid of them.
Last non-Muslim out, dump it all in the sea.
This brings up a somewhat serious question I had about the verification. The famous Reagan line, which I think he borrowed, but it was trust but verify. And I think it's a Russian saying, actually, but he was using it to his audience. And that was used in the context of these nuclear armaments agreements where you should show good faith, but also make sure that the other side is following through. So how do you actually monitor your, not adversary, but your sort of companion in the world community that you're supposed to live peaceably with when you don't really know exactly what's going on? And we sort of have this situation with kind of the non-aligned countries right now of North Korea, Iran, and whoever else, Israel wants us to consider an enemy. But in the Cold War days, I can imagine that would be even more difficult because given the landmass of Russia and the Soviet Union and the less sophisticated technology, how did you actually know what... Well, including how did the Soviets know what the United States was doing, but how did the U.S. know what the Russians were doing, and vice versa, without having lots of inspections, lots of satellite photos, and a lot of spying going on? It seems like you could still get away with a lot.
Yeah, that's all the stuff that you mentioned. Like, some of these things you could actually see from space, not these sort of mobile launchers, but you can see ICBMs from space. You can see...
really? Can't you just put it, underground and then move it over a rail line and then set up and you're good to go?
Yeah, you can have these elaborate, literal underground railroad of nuclear weapon type designs, but in practical terms, they were all in these bases with these silos that were pretty visible. And if you're doing some giant construction project out in the middle of nowhere, like, you've got guys to keep an eye on these things. You also have things like we did actually do, and I believe that we still do, mutual inspections of uranium and plutonium facilities. So, like, you can literally monitor how much fissile material people are making. There's sorts of verification regimes, like there's the plane guillotine. I forget where that is. Probably the Boneyard in Arizona or New Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
There's a gigantic guillotine that was used to chop the wings off of particular models of bombers that were being decommissioned. So
that's fascinating.
The term of art for all of that sort of stuff is national technical measurements, which is shorthand in arms control lingo for we'll all figure it out.
And then what about the UN? I mean, I remember during the Iraq II.
Shit about the UN.
Well, that's sort of my kind of leading question. Did both sides like see them as a neutral third party that they could have come in and represent?
No, the UN. Everybody hates the fucking UN. Like everybody.
I mean, didn't the United States go to the UN in the Cuban Missile Crisis with proof of everything the Soviets were doing?
Well,
and the Soviets were just
like
whatever.
A propaganda thing, like sending a fucking Henry Cabot Lodge, was it? No, it was the other guy. I don't know.
Lodge, I believe, was in Vietnam at the time.
Yeah, Lodge was the Vietnam ambassador. It was the guy who ran it was Al E. Stevenson, sending with like fucking blow up photographs. It's like nobody gives a shit. Like, you're not going to settle this here. Like, you can say
all that comes to mind. Was it before the UN that Netanyahu had his like cartoon bomb?
Yes.
Oh,
it looked like a thermometer, and it was like this is about to break.
When we reach here, this means that they have nuclear weapons.
You will die,
after
Goyim.
the death of 6 million Jews, you will again.
I don't know. I kind of like his spirit. Like, he's just like, well, this is staffed with like half of Africa, and so it's like, well, I guess we need to make it simple for them. But
I mean, you can respect your enemies.
There's a lot to respect in the way he's extremely pro-Israel. I mean, if I had a leader like that, I might not complain.
You actually should. You should respect your enemies. But, don't let them have nukes, which unfortunately they have.
No, well, with a little help from the Germans, by the way. Their submarine fleet is built in Germany.
Yeah, no, I mean, the real cause celeb should be the nuclear disarmament of Israel. You would think the entire world should be able to get behind that. I don't know. Maybe you could repurpose the UN to that exact goal.
Well, they basically vote that way. At least the General Assembly does every couple of years. They have a new resolution being like, "Fuck these guys."
Yeah, but then to actually get substantive support from other nuclear-armed powers to to agree.
But I mean, that's not what the UN is for. The UN is for spreading around bureaucracy dollars, as far as anyone can tell. It's basically a direct subsidy from Western democracies to shitty democracies in parts of Africa. Right. I don't know. Is there anything else that we want to discuss?
Well, I don't know. I mean, you guys ready for nuclear winter?
It's gonna be sweet.
Well, to paraphrase a ecology book that I once had as a kid, the world may not end in a whimper; it may end in a bang.
Hast du etwas Zeit für mich? Singe ich ein Lied für dich von 99 Luftballons auf ihrem Weg zum Horizont. Denkst du vielleicht grad an mich? Dann singe ich ein Lied für dich von 99 Luftballons und dass sowas von sowas kommt. 99 Jahre Krieg ließen keinen Platz für Sieger. Kriegsminister gibt's nicht mehr und auch keine Düsenflieger. Heute zieh ich meine Runden, seh die Welt in Trümmern liegen, hab 'n Luftballon gefunden, denk an dich und lass ihn